Hi, everybody. This is Jesse Bradley, Deputy Director with the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources, here to talk to you today about how July 16th, 2004 changed Nebraska's water management. That's a date when LB 962 was adopted and became a significant change to Nebraska's water laws. So as we were looking at kind of the conditions leading up to LB 962, there was a lot of activity going on in water in Nebraska, not all good. There were lawsuits, a number of those between the state and water users or natural resource districts, and also water users suing water users. And so, not a very good situation. We also had a prolonged drought that began in the early 2000s across most of the state. And we had a number of restrictions that were starting to come in, both for surface water use, groundwater use, and a number of endangered species issues that were also popping up as significant concerns for water management. And so our ability at that time really was fairly reactionary based on the law and structure we had to be able to respond to those issues. And I'm going to touch on kind of some of those events in a little bit more detail. We had a number of headlines, not many of these very positive back at this time, where droughts were really difficult on our folks and expected to get worse. We were starting to see concerns about reservoir levels in Lake McConaughey and other reservoir levels around the state, and lawsuits starting to develop. And we had interstate issues between states over compacts and water rights in water sharing agreements between those states. One of the more noteworthy things that was going on at this time is there was a small creek out in western Nebraska called Pumpkin Creek, and there was litigation going on between a number of folks, including the state and local water users, over how groundwater use was impacting older senior water rights in that area, and became really kind of a poster child of maybe why we needed to look at change to our water laws. So if we look at kind of the conditions in Pumpkin Creek back at that time, leading up to LB 962, we saw that flows in that creek were continuing to decrease as groundwater development and other factors in the area were taking a toll on the water supply. And so this was creating greater and greater conflict in the area. And I will come back to this later in the presentation to show how this is now in a different place today. So as we look at those pre-LB 962 conditions and in a little bit more detail in terms of how groundwater was managed, at that time, Nebraska, we rely on natural resource districts across the state. There's 23 of those entities, and they are our primary entity across the state that manages groundwater. At this time, in the late 90s, early 2000s, there were some tools available to NRDs to manage groundwater for the purpose of surface water, but those tools were pretty lacking. And there also was a pretty significant lacking of funding and other regulatory tools to be able to respond. So that was one of the things that needed to be changed. And so in leading that change, at that time, the governor of Nebraska and legislature worked together to create kind of a new vision by appointing a water policy task force. This was a 49-member task force made up of a variety of constituents, policymakers, water users from groundwater, surface water, municipalities, industry, really to be representative of the variety of issues across the state. And so they came up with a consensus-based recommendation that they submitted to the legislature in late 2003. And that set of recommendations really focused on a more proactive approach to how we manage what we call integrated waters, which are where surface water and groundwater interconnect or hydrologically connected water. And LB 962 was essentially then adopted in 2004 by the legislature and really ushered in a new era of how we were going to manage our water. That bill passed with resounding support, was signed by Governor Johans, became effective on July 16, 2004. So we're now at that kind of 20-year anniversary of that bill. The primary things that it worked to do is recognize the difference in regulatory authorities between the Nebraska Department of Natural Resources. We here at the agency, we focus on permitting and regulation of surface water rights, and that's done through what we call prior appropriations, or first in time, first in right, whereby those users that have older rights are assured of their water supply ahead of those that have rights that came after that time. And then on the groundwater side, we have a much different system. It's regulated by our natural resource districts. It's done through what we call a correlative rights system, or what we would refer to as share and share alike. So essentially, all of the wells in a given aquifer are going to share that resource, and if need for regulation arises, that regulation will generally be evenly distributed across all of those users. Again, LB 962 really had to bring together these two systems because the vast majority of the water resources in Nebraska are hydrologically connected, where groundwater provides some component of flow to a stream through discharge from that aquifer. So very important that we have that resource to manage in Nebraska. So when we look at kind of the boundaries of management, first, these are the surface water boundaries across the state of Nebraska. So you can kind of see the major watersheds where we have the Republican River in the south, Niobrara in the north, a lot of the Platte, Loop, Elkhorn River through the central part of the state, the Blue River Basin southeast, and then other tributaries in the Nemaha Basin to the east. And so, like I said, a number of these basins are going to have components of groundwater flow that discharge to those streams. When we look at the groundwater system, you can notice these are our 23 natural resource districts, and generally those boundaries of those districts were developed to align with those basins. So our groundwater management areas essentially overlay with those same or similar surface water management areas, which is important when we then want to integrate the management of these resources. So what did LB 962 change? It really brought in a set of new tools for surface water and groundwater to be able to manage and control and create incentives for users to reduce use in areas where we needed to reduce use, and to more proactively be thinking about how they're using the resource in those areas that were not under kind of a more stringent control framework. And so specifically out of LB 962, there becomes a requirement in what we call fully and over appropriated areas that the Department of Natural Resources and the local natural resource district work together to develop a plan. And that plan has to contain goals and objectives about sustaining a balance of the water supply, those hydrologically connected supplies. We need maps showing the area and extent of the plan and kind of what types of areas. We can have sub areas that also identify various management activities that would be going on in that plan. The plan also requires that the NRD has at least one control on groundwater, and the department has at least one control on surface water. And then we also set up through these plans shared incentive programs that the department and the Natural Resource District will cooperate on. So I mentioned kind of these fully and over appropriated designations. These were areas that were defined through LB 962 as having more significant resource challenges. And so these areas tended to be in the western part of the state where our water is a little bit more limited and driven oftentimes by interstate matters like the compact in the Republican River Basin, which you see there in southwest Nebraska. And then in the Platte River Basin, there was a number of endangered species issues, and ultimately became something we call the Platte River Program that was folded in to become another element of what we needed to manage to achieve and as an outcome for the state. So we have these fully appropriated areas and these over appropriated areas. These became the areas that were the first areas in the state where IMPs or integrated management plans were developed. And then we'll talk a little bit later about other areas of the state. So in the early days of implementation of LB 962, there certainly were a number of challenges. Primary amongst those was a lot of discussions over, now that we had state and local natural resource districts working together, a lot of questions about who was going to be obligated to achieve certain outcomes, who had the authority to do those. We also had additional interstate litigation starting up in the Republican River Basin over an early period of noncompliance there. We didn't really have dedicated sources of funding in these early days. So there was a lot of question about how we were going to pay for various management actions and incentives that we knew were necessary. I mentioned the Platte River Recovery and Implementation Program. This is the environmental endangered species compliance program that exists through the Central Platte. And that was getting signed in late 2006 and starting in 2007. It became another significant element of what we needed to manage for here in the state. We also here at the department were tasked by the legislature through LB 962 to do an annual evaluation of hydrologically connected waters, which essentially means we were going to look at areas of the state that were not already designated as fully and over appropriated and look more proactively at those areas to see if we needed to get ahead of that in terms of management and making sure we weren't working from behind. We also had to consider how municipal and industrial water users were going to be able to have reliable supplies, growth where needed, and how that was going to be able to be accommodated in these areas where we essentially were halting further development. So out of those early days, there still were some refinements made to the law. There's a few of those listed here on the slide. Probably noteworthy in those was LB 1226 in 2006 required the department to start forecasting water supplies in those areas where we needed to make sure we were complying with interstate compacts. We also worked to establish a greater degree of certainty for municipal and industrial water users by having certain allocations mapped out for those users that they could rely on. And then in 2007, there was a more significant funding resource that got added to the mix through LB 701. And also at this same time, the department, recognizing really the transformational nature of LB 962, we determined that we needed to have a dedicated division that was going to support this new integrated management and our interstate compact work. So we elevated essentially a group of folks to a program, recognizing we would need to have dedicated staff to these efforts. So then as we kind of moved past those early days of implementation, which were admittedly rough, we get in kind of to this middle period. And so we're still sort of working through some of those initial issues, but now we're starting to reach more cooperative ways in which we're trying to organize. We have groups in the Upper Platte, which we refer to as PB-HEP and PBC. These are various Platte Basin organizations where we're bringing together NRDs and stakeholders to have more discussion and organize a little bit more around various actions we can take to help manage our resources in that area. We were getting through the middle part of our interstate litigation, the Republican Basin, and moving that forward. Along with that, we were actually adopting our third generation of integrated management plans. So these plans that we develop are adaptable, and we were recognizing in that early period that we needed to continue to make change to adapt, make sure we were going to be able to meet our compliance obligations. Additionally, during this period, the department, as I mentioned before, we were doing this analysis of other areas of the state to see if they should be designated as fully appropriated. And there were a couple of areas that were designated in those in this middle period, the Lower Platte and the Niobrara Basin, for different reasons. And through that process, we ultimately identified that those did not require that ultimate designation as fully appropriated. But I think that framework leads to then the development of some new laws that I'll discuss here in a moment that I think really became a more proactive approach than we were proceeding with on planning. We were also starting to see in this period some more significant projects being considered and developed. We had large-scale augmentation projects and conjunctive management projects being developed by the natural resource districts in the Platte and Republican Basin. And these really were going to become fairly transformational in terms of the way we would manage water in those basins. So as I alluded to, there were some new law changes that came on the heels of this period. We saw those reversals in those fully appropriated designations that led to some new components of law that essentially laid out a way in which we would manage in kind of a more proactive and consistent manner across these areas. It also provided a means for entering into voluntary integrated management plans. So the department and local natural resource districts could agree that we wanted to move forward with an integrated management plan in these areas. And then in 2014, we got another round of funding that was developed as LB 1098 with the Water Sustainability Fund. And that really helped provide another source of opportunity to those areas that were not only fully and over appropriated, but other areas of the state where they could proactively be looking at projects and activities that would help them advance their water management. At this time, too, here at the department, we were really starting to advance our management tools and information that we have available for stakeholders and NRDs to utilize and make decisions. We realized we needed to have groundwater models, which are really critical to understanding how use of the aquifer affects streams across the state. So we needed those tools and recognized that and began developing those across the entire state. So then as we come forward to what I would refer to as kind of a more recent period, number of things happening still in this era, kind of started with a bang, if you will, in terms of the flash drought of 2012. And that really led us to pursuing even greater voluntary, more proactive planning efforts. 2012 was a period when we saw some historically low flows in the lower Platte Basin, and so that prompted folks to think about how do we manage our resources in a way that recognizes the connectivity amongst all of these natural resource districts in the Loop and Elkhorn and Lower Platte, and how those impacts may affect things like flows in the Lower Platte that are critical to Lincoln and Omaha's water supplies for their municipalities. So that was one significant effort pursued through a voluntary means. The litigation in the Republican Basin wrapped up in this period, so it gave us kind of a greater degree of certainty and confidence on how that was going to resolve. There was also an effort in the Niobrara Basin where a water right that was traditionally used for hydropower production but became essentially a significant limiting factor in development in that basin was pursued through a cooperative arrangement of natural resource districts and the Nebraska Game and Parks Commission to purchase that water right, ultimately with the goal of transforming it, which has now happened into a different purpose. We also saw through this era that all of the NRDs across the entire state began to do integrated management planning. You can see on the map here the green and yellow areas representing those areas that are done through a voluntary process. So I think we were starting to take away the scary aspects of this new law and see people really begin to see the benefits of the department working with local natural resource districts to achieve better outcomes for our constituents by working together. We also saw in the Republican River Basin, importantly, we were seeing that we were moving away from some of this litigation of the past through efforts, various resolutions that were adopted by the Republican River Compact Administration, or what we call RRCA. We adopted a number of resolutions that really were a recognition that we didn't need to go through litigation if we were able to sit down as states, understand each other's differences and what we needed as outcomes, and really work together collaboratively. We could achieve a better outcome than going through those litigations. And so that really ushered in a new era of the three states, Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska, working together, which is still successful today. We also saw in 2019 that the Platte River program, which was set to conclude after its first 13-year increment in 2019, was deemed successful enough that folks wanted to see that extended for an additional period to extend for another 13 years. So that coincided with some work we did also to extend those integrated management plans for an additional 10-year period. So a lot of great programs going on through this time, a lot of efforts all across the state. That funding that we had created was being used to do a lot of incentives and good studies to look at how we could better manage our water. What we saw leading out of this period was really that our laws were stabilizing and we didn't really need significant change. And I think that's an indication of people's recognition that this process is working successfully. I did want to just touch on briefly the important role that science and data collection plays in integrated management. And so here at the department, we focus a lot of our efforts on monitoring stream flow because that's what we manage is the water directly used out of streams. We have a dedicated set of gauges that we operate and maintain and provide out to the public for a variety of uses. We were doing that and have been doing that for a number of years, really focusing on how surface water is available. And then groundwater really was monitored by local natural resource districts. They do a great job of annually going out and taking thousands of measurements all across the state, aggregating that information up into water level change maps so that we can keep a status on how our aquifers are performing year over year. And so we really have had the benefit of both the department and natural resource districts spending significant efforts on monitoring for a number of years and had a good foundation leading into integrated management and LB 962, but really have taken that to the next level here over the last couple decades. That's come about through groundwater models, our tools that we use to monitor and assess how aquifer use is affecting stream flow. We have these tools really available all across the state, and they rely on significant data from both groundwater monitoring and surface water monitoring, as well as monitoring of how we're using the water. And so a lot of effort's gone into supporting these models and using these as means to be able to look forward on how our management is going to affect future water availability. We've worked through various means to take information and begin to make it more accessible to folks. One effort the department did was a project we called Insight, which was aimed at providing sort of a dashboard where people could get access to water supply and use information all across the state. There's other examples of this across the department and the natural resource districts as well. We've also worked on developing what we would call decision support tools, These are essentially tools that allow us to look at those opportunities and using that water so that it helps offset the need for regulatory actions. This effort has proven very successful in the Upper Platte River Basin, where we've been able to divert hundreds of thousands of acre feet of excess flow and get that water into unlined canals where it can recharge the aquifer and then increase future stream flows. And that's a benefit not only to the water users in those areas, it becomes a nice benefit to those irrigation district partners we work with, that we can provide some funding that they can reinvest into their infrastructure, and then also provides the state a means to capture water that would have otherwise exited the state unused. Drought monitoring has become a more significant component of our management. We have actually dedicated drought plans that we've worked on in the Lower Platte River, the Upper Platte River Basin, and the Republican River Basin. Those have been really motivated and driven by stakeholder input, where folks have really identified drought as the primary concerns happen in terms of water supply, not surprisingly. So we've created tools where people can more proactively see the onset of those droughts and be prepared for those. This is an example of a product we developed in conjunction with folks in the Lower Platte, focusing on water availability to Lincoln and MUD's well fields and how that may be affected by drought. We've worked all across the state with the natural resource districts to get information and data sets together that allow us to create maps and products that allow us to know where all of the parcels all across the state that can be legally irrigated are located. These are very valuable in terms of helping us with our modeling efforts, but also just generally helping folks know where water is available, can be accessed, and as needed, transferred and moved around for other purposes. I think there's a wide array of benefits that have been created by integrated management, and I think a lot of these have been demonstrated over the last 2 decades. We certainly have seen stabilization and more reliable stream flows, as well as improvements in protections that are being taken to manage aquifers across the state. We're really working now with those available state funds to leverage those with local funding and federal funding, which really allows for a more efficient funding mix as it goes into various projects and incentive programs. We certainly have become much more proactive and forward-looking in our water management. Communication has been really critical throughout all of this. We do a significant effort each time we develop a plan to bring stakeholders together with those natural resource districts and ourselves and make sure that we're talking about these issues openly. That stakeholder input really becomes critical to helping define the goals and objectives that will define ultimate success of these plans. And that really happens from the bottom up in these areas. We've got an increased ability to adapt to changing conditions because I think in part because we're communicating more frequently with our stakeholders and our partners, but also because of the types of tools and programs we've been able to develop over time. We've got a significant investment in the science and data that has also improved our ability to manage and have greater confidence, reduce uncertainty to our water users. We have also, through this process, maintained that local control. If you go into these integrated management plans, you'll see that each is unique to that natural resource districts. The way they want to tackle the challenges and look at those opportunities, those vary amongst each NRD. That ability to pool resources and manage larger geographic areas via basin-wide plans has been very critical. I mentioned the areas in the Lower Platte and Upper Platte and Republican where we have these basin-wide plans. Some of the efforts that have been able to be done by working across those political boundaries and bringing more partners together. The voluntary IMP process has definitely, promoted a more proactive approach, engaged more folks across the state in this process, and helping folks just understand how their water's managed and what we're doing to try to make sure they have water, not only today, but water tomorrow. We make an effort every time in developing these plans to make sure there's a balance of state and local controls and collaboration there. And most of this is done through a consensus-based approach where we're bringing both of our thoughts to the table, both local and state, thoughts to the table, but really then leaving with a consensus-based decision on how to proceed. So I think overall, it creates a greater environment for regulatory certainty for our water users. And like I said, that knowledge that they can have water today and water tomorrow. And as you kind of look nationally and even internationally, really, I think folks have started to look at Nebraska's model of integrated management and really hold it up as, a very effective water management model. There's been some subsequent refinements to LB 962, but I think looking back now 20 years, after the fact, it is really remarkable the transformational change that had on our water management in this state. We certainly have seen reduced litigation. We've really enhanced that cooperation between local natural resource districts and the Department of Natural Resources. We've got tools in place to be more able to respond to droughts. And really throughout this, the key has been those partnerships along the way. The natural resource districts are great partners and have really helped us get things accomplished probably at a greater pace than we could have done without them, certainly as partners. And, not only those partnerships, but the partnerships of stakeholders that engage in this process and participate with us in the NRDs. Those partnerships, too, have been really key to making sure we're moving forward in the right direction and making positive outcomes for all Nebraskans. So, I think if you kind of look at those headlines I had at the beginning of the presentation, we see a much different tone today in Nebraska's water management. The headlines of today are much more positive. Like I said, we're moving past those litigations. We're moving forward with voluntary initiatives. People are seeing the benefits of getting through this process of integrated management and the outcomes that it can create. We've had funding opportunities that have really allowed us to reinvest in our water, which we know is our most critical natural resource in the state. And we've moved on from some of these interstate issues that were really challenging in the early 2000s as we were initially getting going and finding better relationships there with our neighboring states. And I did want to just bring this back kind of full circle with Pumpkin Creek, which I showed was sort of the poster child for LB 962 and the challenges we were facing there with ever declining stream flows. And those stream flows certainly did bottom out right around the time LB 962 was passed, really getting to zero at a point. As we look where we are today and how those have begun to recover, and then as we use some of those modeling tools and look at how our management is likely to affect future outcomes, we see that we've really made a turnaround in that basin. And, this is just one example of, I think, a lot of the success we've seen across the state, but just highlighting this one because it was such a contentious area at the beginning of this process to show that, if we work together, we have these difficult conversations and we come up with collaborative solutions and make those investments that we can create positive outcomes into the future. So looking forward, I think LB 962 created this great framework for water management in Nebraska. As I said a little bit earlier, Nebraska really is now the envy of the nation and the world in terms of how we collaboratively manage our water. I personally meet with folks from other countries, other states, and they want to know how our process works. And it really is a great recipe here in Nebraska that has allowed us to have a lot of success. We see that there are certainly areas in the state like the Republican River Basin and the Upper Platte systems and those areas out west. We're going to have to remain vigilant in those areas. There's still a little bit more water challenged than other areas of the state. But if we stay on top of that, which I know we will, those areas will continue to be in a very good place going into the future. We need to look for those opportunities to further optimize our water use. There's a lot of investments in technology, I think, that we can still bring to our producers and water users across the state that can help with more efficient use of water, improving their water infrastructure, and really allowing us to focus on that economic viability, not only today, but in the future. And so, we're going to continue to look for those opportunities to leverage our funding resources, both at the state and local level with federal resources as we work to tackle, issues related to our soils, our water quantity, our water quality, and making sure that that's a resilient system as we move forward. I think where we are today, we started this process 20 years ago, really in a defensive posture, having to respond to a lot of issues all across the state that weren't good. But, where we've come over the last 2 decades with a lot of help from local natural resource districts and other partners is to a place where now we have a really solid foundation and we can really play offense in terms of how we manage our water, in terms of being proactive and making sure we have water today and water tomorrow.